Why do we tell stories? That's a really big question. We can ask this question in a lot of different ways, each of which will prompt a different kind of answer. For example, if I ask, what use is literature? You might be more likely to think that literature should be useful the way other things like phones and cameras are useful. Maybe that's the right way to think about literature. Maybe it's not. If I ask, why do we tell stories? Maybe you won't think about use so much, but you might think of what inclines humans to enjoy stories. Enjoy, love, be inspired by, etc. This might be the right way to think about stories. Then again, it might not. You decide. Then there's the distinction, which you may have noticed in that pair of questions, between literature and stories. Of course, not all literature contains stories or narrative. Lyric poetry, for example, is more meditation than plot-driven. But most literature does contain stories. So what's the difference? When I say stories, that friendly, informal word, I may or may not be talking about the kind of written down, carefully crafted literary narratives that scholars spend so much time thinking about. And while we can talk about the kind of stories that we tell our friends over a drink, in the same way we talk about stories in a school setting, using the same analytical terms, character, narrator, irony, symbol, figurative language, we're likely to get more out of our analysis, more substance to chew on, if we analyze stories that have been written down and carefully revised for maximum effect. So another thing we have to decide when we're talking about stories or literature is whether we see the kinds of stories we tell every day as essentially the same as the stories we call literature, or not. Does the extra time and care taken in literary narratives put those stories in a separate category from the ones we tell our friends? There's another thing for you to decide. Once you've decided on whether to think about literature or stories, and whether you should think about those stories as useful or something else, you've got to decide on a verb. Do you want to know why we tell stories? Why we write stories? Why we read stories? Enjoy stories? Study stories? Now you've got endless permutations of the question available. You could say, what use is it to study literature? Or stories. Why do we study stories? Why do we read stories? Why do we read literature? You get the picture. When you made your decisions about which question you want to ask, then you get to answer it, which is a whole other process. But don't worry, finding the question is half the quest.
Powered by Video.